moment at the wedding radically changed your attitude towards the bridegroom? Story 1. At my cousin's wedding, everything seemed perfect. The bride was stunning, the groom looked happy, and the atmosphere was lively. I had always liked his fiancée, though I didn't know her well. That changed during the father-daughter dance. Her dad, a quiet and kind man, was in a wheelchair due to an accident years ago. The bride had planned a special moment where they would sway together, with him holding on to her as best as he could. As the music played, you could see the emotion in his eyes. He was overwhelmed with love and pride. But halfway through the dance, the bride suddenly stepped back and laughed. "Okay, that's enough. This is getting too embarrassing," she said, waving her hand dismissively. The room went silent. Her dad's face fell, and he awkwardly wheeled himself back to his seat while she strutted off to her friends. I saw the hurt in his eyes and my stomach twisted. From that moment on, I couldn't see her the same way. The wedding went on, but I kept thinking about how she had humiliated her father in front of everyone. If she could treat her dad like that, how would she treat my cousin in a few? Story 2. I was the best man at my childhood friend's wedding. He was marrying a woman who seemed sweet and kind, but I didn't know her well. That night, I learned more than I ever wanted to. After the ceremony, we were all drinking and celebrating when the bride's phone lit up next to me. I glanced at it without thinking, and my heart nearly stopped. A message popped up from someone named Babe. "Can't wait to see you after this is over. I'll make it worth your while." I told myself I must be misunderstanding something. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe an old conversation. But then she walked over, picked up her phone, read the message, and smirked. Without hesitation, she texted back, "I'll let you know when he passes out." My stomach dropped. I felt sick. My best friend, a guy who had loved this woman with everything he had, was in the middle of the happiest day of his life, and she was planning to cheat on him that very night. I wanted to tell him right then and there, but I knew it would destroy him. So I waited until after the honeymoon. When I finally showed him the proof, he just sat in silence, staring at the wall. 2 months later, they divorced. Story 3. The moment that changed everything for me at my sister's wedding wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a single glance. She had always been my best friend, and I was thrilled she had found someone who made her happy. The wedding was beautiful, and her groom, Mark, was the picture of charm until the reception. My sister's childhood dog, Daisy, was old but still waddled around, tail wagging. Our mom had brought Daisy to the reception as a surprise, knowing how much my sister loved her. She ran over, eyes shining, and knelt beside Daisy, hugging her and talking to her in that silly baby voice. "Mark?" he sneered. Not in an obvious way, but I caught it. A brief look of disgust, annoyance, like he was watching something pathetic. When my sister looked up at him, smiling, that expression disappeared, replaced with his usual fake warmth. But I saw it. From then on, I paid more attention. I noticed how he only smiled when people were watching, how he let little condescending comments slip when no one else was listening. That glance at the dog told me everything. He didn't respect the things my sister. Years later, when their marriage fell apart because of his controlling behavior, I wasn't surprised. I just wished I had warned her early. Story 4. My friend's wedding was set in a gorgeous vineyard, everything meticulously planned. The bride was a woman we had all come to love, smart, kind, and incredibly down-to-earth. The groom was a guy we thought was lucky to have her. That night, he proved he didn't deserve her. During the reception, the best man gave a speech, cracking some lighthearted jokes before saying, "But really, we all know Jake is one lucky guy. Amy is an incredible woman, and we're all grateful to have her in our lives." "The groom?" he scoffed, loud enough for everyone to hear. Then he leaned into the mic and said, Yeah, but let's be real. She's the lucky one." The laughter was hesitant, awkward. Amy smiled, but I could see the way her fingers tightened around her champagne glass. He wasn't joking. His tone was smug, self-satisfied. For the rest of the night, I noticed things I hadn't before. How he interrupted her, how he barely looked at her when she spoke, how he made everything about himself. It was as if the moment he had that ring on her finger, she was just another possession. They lasted 2 years before she finally left. She told me later that moment at the wedding was when she first felt it too. Story 5. I went to my coworker's wedding expecting a fun, lighthearted evening. The groom was a charismatic, easygoing guy, and his fiancée was the sweetest woman I had ever met. She had a quiet kindness, always making sure everyone felt included. The reception was lively, and when it was time for the bouquet toss, everyone cheered. The bride playfully turned her back, threw it high, and one of her bridesmaids, a woman I'd never met, caught it with an excited shriek. Everyone clapped, but then the groom snatched the mic from the DJ and grinned. "Guess that means you're next, huh?" he said, gesturing to the bridesmaid's boyfriend. The guy laughed, but the bridesmaid blushed and shook her head. The groom, still smiling, leaned in and said into the mic, "Oh, don't worry. If he won't marry you, I can take you for a spin instead." Silence. The bride's face went pale. The bridesmaid awkwardly laughed it off, but the damage was done. The worst part? He didn't even notice. He kept grinning like he had just made the best joke of the night. His new wife, on the other hand, just stared at him, her hands clenched in her lap. That was the moment I knew. He wasn't the charming guy we all thought. He was the kind of man who didn't respect boundaries, even his own wife's. 3 years later, she left him. I wasn't surprised. Story 6. At my brother's wedding, I was excited to welcome my new sister-in-law into the family. She had always been polite, a little reserved, but seemed to love my brother. The wedding itself was stunning, until the cake-cutting moment. The bride and groom were standing together, laughing as they got ready to cut the cake. Everyone was cheering, expecting a cute moment where they'd playfully feed each other a bite. Instead, the bride grabbed a piece and smashed it into my brother's face so hard that he actually stumbled backward. The room went silent. She laughed and turned to the crowd, expecting everyone to join in. But my brother? He didn't laugh. He wiped the cake off his face and muttered, "Why would you do that?" Her response? "Because I wanted to embarrass you." It wasn't playful. It wasn't a joke. It was malicious. My stomach dropped. It was the first moment I saw her for who she really was. Over the years, I watched as she slowly chipped away at his confidence, belittled him in front of others, and manipulated him into thinking he was always in the wrong. That moment at the wedding? It was just the beginning. Story 7. I attended a wedding where the bride had an ex as one of her bridesmaids. People thought it was odd, but she and her fiancé had assured everyone that it was fine. They were just friends now. Fast forward to the reception. The groom and bride were dancing when the DJ announced that guests could now join them. That's when the ex walked straight up, cut in between them, and took the bride's hands right out of the groom's. At first, everyone laughed, thinking it was just a joke. But then the ex pulled her in close and whispered something in her ear. Her face turned red, and instead of pushing him away, she just smiled shyly. The groom? He just stood there, stunned. For the rest of the night, she kept going back to the ex's table, whispering and giggling like they were at a high school dance. The groom? He was basically a ghost at his own wedding. I heard later that he filed for an annulment within 2 months. Apparently, that night confirmed something he had suspected for a long time. He wasn't her first choice. Story 8. My cousin was marrying a woman who had always seemed a little high maintenance, but we thought she just liked the finer things in life. No big deal, right? Wrong. The first red flag came when she threw a tantrum. Yes, a full-on stomping her foot tantrum, because the flowers in the venue weren't the exact shade of ivory she had asked. The second red flag was when she made a server cry because her drink wasn't cold enough. But the worst part? The vows. The groom poured his heart out, talking about how he fell in love with her, how he couldn't wait to grow old with her, how he wanted to be the best husband possible. When it was the bride's turn, she sighed dramatically, pulled a piece of paper from her cleavage, and read her vows off a crumpled napkin. They were basically a joke, full of sarcastic remarks about how he better not get fat, and how she put up with him, even though she had way better offers. People laughed nervously, thinking it was just her humor. But I saw my cousin's face drop. The marriage lasted less than a year. She drained his bank account and left. Story 9. I was a bridesmaid at my best friend's wedding, and I had always been supportive of her relationship until the rehearsal dinner. The groom was drinking with his groomsmen when someone jokingly asked if he was ready for the ball and chain. Instead of brushing it off, the groom chugged his beer, slammed the glass down, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, I already cheated, so at least I got that out of my system." Silence. His groomsmen laughed uncomfortably, and one even tried to cover it up by saying, "Dude, shut up," but I saw the way he smirked. He wasn't joking. My best friend walked in just minutes later, glowing and excited, completely oblivious. I felt like I was going to be sick. I didn't say anything then, but after the wedding, I told her. She confronted him. He denied it. She believed him. Until 6 months later when she caught him with her coworker. She called me in tears. All I could do was remind her of that moment at the rehearsal dinner. The moment I knew. Story 10. My uncle had been dating his fiancée for about 2 years before they decided to tie the knot. She was charming, good with kids, and always seemed so warm and loving. But that completely changed the second she said, "I do." It was like a switch flipped. Within an hour of the ceremony, she stopped smiling. She barely spoke to anyone except her own family. My uncle, still riding the high of the day, didn't seem to notice at first. But when we got to the reception, she suddenly pulled him aside and started whisper yelling at him. He looked confused, then upset. Then she grabbed his wrist, hard. I don't think she realized people were watching, but I saw it. And so did my mom. Later that night, he made a speech about how excited he was to build a life together, and she just rolled her eyes. Right there, in front of everyone. It took years for him to finally leave. Turns out, she had manipulated him into marriage, made him cut off friends and family, and controlled everything he did. That wedding? It wasn't a celebration. It was a trap. Story 11. I attended a wedding where the groom's mother was completely against the marriage. She had made it clear that she thought the bride was beneath her son, and had even tried to talk him out of it. But the wedding still went ahead, and everyone thought she had come around. We were wrong. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, she stood up. Not only that, but she pulled out a letter and started reading a list of reasons why her son shouldn't marry this woman. She doesn't come from a good family. She will never make enough money. She's only with him because she can't do better. The bride started crying. The groom? He looked like he was about to explode. He told his mother to sit down, but she refused. Finally, he yelled, "If you don't shut up, you won't be in our lives anymore." The whole room was frozen. His mom slowly sat down, fuming. The wedding continued, but the mood was ruined. The bride was visibly shaken, and the groom barely smiled for the rest of the night. The kicker? His mom left right after the vows and never spoke to them again. Story 12. I worked at a wedding venue and witnessed one of the worst groom reveals ever. It was a destination wedding, and the couple had been staying at the resort for a week leading up to the big day. On the morning of the wedding, the bride was getting ready when her maid of honor's phone started blowing up. She checked it and went dead silent. Turns out the groom was caught hooking up with a resort staff member, less than 24 hours before the wedding. The best man saw it happen and told the maid of honor, hoping she'd stop the wedding before it was too late. The bride? She didn't say a word. She finished getting ready. She walked down the aisle. She smiled for the photos, and when it came time for the vows, she took a deep breath and said, "I'd like to go first." She pulled her phone out and started reading. It was a full description of everything the groom had done, complete with the names of the people involved and direct quotes from his texts. The groom turned white. His family started whispering. The bride finished reading, looked him in the eye, and said, "You don't deserve me. This wedding is over." She dropped the mic, literally, and walked out. The entire place erupted into chaos. Best wedding I've ever been to. Story 13. At my coworker's wedding, everything seemed perfect. The ceremony was beautiful. The venue was elegant, and the groom was completely smitten. Then came the bride's toast. She stood up, smiled sweetly, and began talking about how lucky she was to have such a devoted and patient husband. Cute, right? But then she said something that made everyone shift uncomfortably. "He's been so understanding of my mistakes, and I just want to say thank you for forgiving." Forgiving her for what? A few of us exchanged looks, but we brushed it off. Then she continued, "I know a lot of people here think what I did was unforgivable, but love means second chances." At this point, even the groom looked confused. Then she dropped the ball, "And I promise this time I'll never cheat again." Gasps. Stunned silence. The groom's mother grabbed his arm, whispering furiously. He looked like someone had just punched him in the gut. Turns out, he had no idea she had cheated on. He just found out at his own wedding. The marriage? Annulled within a month. Story 14. My friend's wedding had one of the most uncomfortable first dances I've ever seen. Everything was normal, until the groom suddenly stopped dancing and said, loud enough for the microphone to catch, "I just need to say something." He let go of his bride and turned to face the entire room. Everyone went silent. "I made a mistake. I can't do this." The bride froze. The guests looked around, confused. Then, he just walked away. No explanation. No big speech. He just left. The bride stood there, stunned, before bursting into tears. Her bridesmaids rushed to her side. His family looked horrified. The guests sat there, not knowing what to do. It turns out, he had been having doubts for months but was too scared to say anything. So, he waited until the worst possible moment. The wedding was obviously called off, but the venue had already been paid for. So the bride's family turned the reception into a screw him party. Honestly, best after party ever. Story 15. At my cousin's wedding, the bride's ex-boyfriend showed up uninvited. At first, everyone assumed he was just a distant friend because he was sitting in the back, quietly watching. But once the reception started, he got drunk. That's when things went south. While the bride and groom were dancing, he grabbed the mic. Everyone assumed he was going to give a toast. Maybe something awkward but harmless. Nope, he started crying. "I just need to say this. I still love you." The room went silent. The bride looked mortified. The groom? Furious. Then the ex dropped to his knees and begged her to leave with him. "You don't love him. You love me." "I know you do." Security had to escort him out. The groom was shaking with rage. The bride? She just looked guilty. A year later, the couple got divorced. Turns out the ex was right. She had never stopped loving him. Story 16. I was at a wedding where the bride's secret life came out in the worst way possible. Everything seemed normal. Beautiful decorations, happy couple, cheerful guests. That was until the groom's sister stood up for her toast. She started with the usual sweet words about her brother, but then her tone changed. She looked the bride dead in the eye and said, "I just have one question. Does he know about your other husband?" Gasps. The groom laughed awkwardly and said, "What?" Thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. The sister pulled out her phone and started reading out loud a string of Facebook messages between the bride and her actual husband in another state. Turns out the bride had never divorced her first husband. She had been living a double life, and her real husband had no idea she was getting remarried. The groom turned pale, looked at the bride and whispered, "Tell me this isn't true." She just sat there, speechless. Then she burst into tears and ran out of the venue. Wedding? Cancelled. Marriage? Didn't happen. The bride disappeared after that night and nobody ever saw her again. Story 17. At my friend's wedding, the groom was a completely different person after saying, "I do." Before the wedding, he was kind, funny, and seemed completely in love with the bride. But the moment the ceremony ended, he switched. It started with the photos. The photographer asked him to smile and he muttered, "Why? I got what I wanted." Then, during the reception, the bride asked him to dance, and he sighed dramatically and said, "Do I have to?" In front of everyone. His groomsmen started noticing the shift too. When one of them playfully said, "Looks like you're a married man now," the groom smirked and replied, "Yeah, but not a free." The final straw? When the bride was hugging her mom, he walked up behind her, grabbed her arm and whispered, "We're leaving soon. This party's over." The joy completely drained from her face. It was like she realized she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. They stayed married for less than a year. Turns out, he had been pretending to be a good guy until he secured her. Then his true colors came out. Story 18. At a distant cousin's wedding, the bride's maid of honor did something unforgivable. The maid of honor and the groom had always been a little too friendly, but the bride trusted her. She always laughed off concerns, saying, "They're just good friends." Well, during the bouquet toss, the bride playfully threw it into the crowd and the maid of honor caught it. Everyone cheered until the groom ran up to her, lifted her off the ground, and spun her around in excitement. The crowd went dead silent. The bride's face turned pale. You could see her connecting the dots in real time. Then, without thinking, she snatched the mic from the DJ and said, "You know what? If you two are so happy, take it." She ripped off her veil, threw it at them, and walked out. The groom didn't even go after. Turns out, the bride had been right to be suspicious. Her best friend and fiancé had been seeing each other for months. They got married later that year. Story 19. I was at a wedding where the bride got arrested mid-reception. She had always been a little wild, but no one expected the night to end with her in handcuffs. It started with a drunken argument. Someone spilled a drink on her dress, and instead of brushing it off, she flipped out and started screaming at a waiter. The groom tried to calm her down, but she shoved him, hard. Then she grabbed a champagne bottle and threw it across the room. At that point, the venue staff called security, and before we knew it, cops were walking in. As they tried to escort her out, she kicked one of the officers. That was it. They put her in handcuffs and dragged her out. The groom just stood there, frozen. You could see the horror settling in. The marriage lasted 5 days. Story 20. At my coworker's wedding, the groom's best man confessed something horrible. During his speech, the best man started off by saying how much he loved his friend, how they had been through thick and thin, and how he was so happy to see him marry the love of his life. Then he paused, and then he said, "But I can't keep this secret any." The room went completely silent. He turned to the bride and said, "I have to tell you the truth. Your husband has been cheating on you." Gasps. People started murmuring, trying to figure out if this was some kind of sick joke. The best man pulled out his phone and read messages between the groom and another woman. Messages from the night before the wedding. The bride didn't even cry. She just nodded slowly, took off her ring and placed it on the table. Then she walked out. The groom chased after her, begging, but she never looked back. Best man never spoke to him again. Story 21. My cousin's wedding was supposed to be a dream event. The bride was beautiful, the venue was stunning, and everything seemed perfect until the groom's phone went off at the reception. Normally, no one would care, but he was standing at the sweetheart table, mid-bite, when it buzzed. He looked down at the screen and his entire face went pale. The bride noticed. "Who is it?" she asked playfully, but he ignored her, pressing his lips together. Then, without a word, he stood up and walked away. The bride, confused, called after him. He didn't even turn around. A few of us at the table exchanged looks. The best man hurried after him, and they had a whispered, tense conversation near the entrance. Then, chaos. A woman stormed in, pregnant, about 6 or 7 months along. She was crying and furious, yelling, "You're really going to pretend like I don't exist? Like we don't exist?" The room fell into dead silence. The bride looked at her husband, eyes wide, shaking her head in disbelief. "Who is she?" The groom buried his face in his hands. That's when the woman, now full-on screaming, shouted, "I'm having his baby!" The bride just collapsed into a chair. Turns out, he had been seeing this woman behind her back, and she had found out about the wedding from social media. She waited until they were legally married before exposing the truth. The bride filed for annulment the next day. Story 22. I was the maid of honor at my best friend's wedding, and I thought she had found the perfect guy. He was charming, successful, and treated her like gold. But then, at the rehearsal dinner, I walked into the wrong room at the hotel and caught him on the phone, saying something that made my stomach drop. "Yeah, don't worry, babe. She'll never find out." I froze. He was cheating, and he was planning to keep it going even after the wedding. I debated what to do. If I told her now, it would destroy her. If I said nothing, I'd be letting her marry a liar. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I waited. And then, at the wedding toast, I walked up with my glass of champagne, smiled at the guests, then turned to him and said, "Before we all celebrate, I just want to ask the groom, how many other women have you promised she'll never find out?" Silence. The bride turned to him in horror. "What is she talking about?" I pulled out my phone and played the recording I had made the night before. The groom's face went bloodless. The bride took off her ring, dropped it in his drink, and walked out of her own wedding. Story 23. I was at my brother's wedding when I noticed something off about the groom's father. He kept staring at my brother, not in the usual father of the bride protective way, but in a way that felt familiar. During dinner, I saw him drinking heavily, growing red-faced and emotional. Finally, he grabbed the mic and slurred, "I have a confession." "Oh no. I know this isn't the time, but it's eating me alive." He turned to his daughter, the bride. "Sweetheart, I need to tell you something about your mother." The room froze. "I should have told you years ago, but I just never had the guts. I didn't know how." His hands shook. The bride whispered, "Dad, what are you talking about?" He took a deep breath, then looked directly at my brother and said, "He's your half-brother." Screams. Gasps. The bride pushed her chair back so fast it tipped over. My brother? He looked like he was about to throw up. The father? He just buried his face in his hands and muttered, "I'm so sorry." Turns out, my brother's mom had an affair with his bride's father. The wedding was instantly canceled. Story 24. At my friend's wedding, the bride's wedding dress was ruined in the worst possible way. She had spent months designing it, having it custom-made with delicate lace from her grandmother's gown. She talked about it nonstop. At the reception, while we were all mingling, I heard a loud gasp. I turned and saw red wine soaking the bride's dress. People gasped. The bride's face turned ashen. The worst part? The culprit wasn't an accident. It was the groom's ex. She had snuck into the reception pretending to be a distant cousin. Then, in the middle of the night, she grabbed a glass of red wine and poured it down the back of the dress. The bride was sobbing. The groom was furious. The ex just smirked and said, "Oops." The bride ended up changing into a simple white dress, but the night was ruined. The ex ? She got escorted out by security. The couple went on their honeymoon, but ended up divorcing later because the groom was still secretly talking to his ex. Story 25. I went to a wedding where the bride ran away, literally. She had always been nervous about getting married, but chalked it up to cold feet. The morning of the wedding, she was quiet, distant, but everyone reassured her. Then, at the altar, the officiant asked, "Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" And she just stood there. People started shifting in their seats. The groom looked at her, confused. He whispered, "Babe?" Then, without a word, she turned and sprinted. Not walked. Sprinted. She kicked off her heels and bolted out of the venue, leaving everyone in stunned silence. The groom? He just stood there, jaw hanging open. His best man awkwardly patted his back. No one saw her for days. When she finally resurfaced, she admitted she had been in love with someone else the whole time, but was too scared to call off the wedding. So she panicked and ran. Story 26. At my uncle's wedding, I witnessed a moment so chilling that it changed my entire perception of his new bride. She had always been polite but strangely distant, and my uncle was head over heels in love with her. The wedding was lavish, expensive, and seemingly flawless until the first dance. As they swayed to their chosen song, my uncle whispered something to her and smiled. A sweet, romantic moment, but instead of smiling back, her face twitched in irritation. Then she muttered, "Don't breathe on me." The music was soft enough that I was one of the few who heard it. My uncle laughed nervously, assuming she was joking. But she wasn't. She stepped away mid-dance and walked off the floor. Everyone awkwardly clapped, thinking maybe she was just overwhelmed. But I watched as she walked over to her bridesmaids, rolling her eyes, whispering, "God, he's so clingy." My uncle? He was standing alone in the middle of the dance floor, completely lost. That was the moment I knew. She didn't love him. She never had. She just wanted the wedding, not the marriage. They lasted 8 months. Story 27. I was bartending at a wedding when the groom's secret came out in the worst way possible. The reception was in full swing, and the bride was glowing, laughing, dancing, completely in love. The groom seemed fine until a mysterious woman showed up. She walked straight to the bar, ordered a drink, and stared daggers at the groom. Finally, she grabbed the microphone from the DJ, clinked her glass, and raised a toast. "Congratulations to the happy couple. I just have one question for the groom. Did you think you could marry her while I'm carrying your baby?" Chaos. The bride went completely still. The groom turned white as a ghost. People gasped, whispering in shock. The woman walked straight up to the bride, handed her a printed-out paternity test, and said, "Check the date. 3 months ago." The bride slowly read the paper. Her hands shook. She looked at her husband, now frozen, sweating. Then, she took her wedding ring off, dropped it into his drink, and walked out. Best mic drop moment I've ever seen. Story 28. My cousin was always obsessed with perfection. Her wedding was no different. Custom gowns, rehearsed vows, even a contract for her bridesmaids on how they should act. But she took it too far. Right before walking down the aisle, one of her bridesmaids tripped and tore the hem of her dress. It wasn't bad, barely noticeable. But my cousin? She lost it. She screamed at her, called her an embarrassment. Then, in front of all of us, she said, "You're ruining my wedding. Get out." The bridesmaid burst into tears and tried to apologize, but the bride shoved her bouquet at her and told her to leave. We were all horrified. The girl left, crying, and the rest of us were too scared to say anything. That was the moment I realized my cousin didn't care about the people there. She cared about the pictures, the aesthetic, the perfection. The groom? He must have noticed it too, because 2 months later, he filed for divorce. Story 29. At my best friend's wedding, the officiant read the wrong vows. The ceremony was outside. Everything was gorgeous. The officiant pulled out his book of vows and started reading the groom's part first. Except, something was off. Instead of talking about love and devotion, he said, "I promise to support your dreams, even when they lead you away from me." The groom furrowed his brow. The bride's face turned red. The officiant kept reading, oblivious. "I accept that we may never grow old together, but I will always love you." At that point, the groom stopped him. "Where did you get these vows?" he asked, voice tight. The officiant, confused, said, "They were given to me this morning by the bride." The bride went silent. Turns out those were her vows to her ex, the man she still loved. The wedding ended right there. Story 30. This happened at my coworker's wedding, and I swear it was like a bad soap opera. Everything was going well until the bouquet toss. The bride turned her back, counted down, and threw it into the air. A group of women lunged for it. But before it hit the ground, one of them, a woman no one recognized, caught it. Then, she walked to the groom, threw the bouquet at his chest, and said, "You told me last night you weren't going through with this." Dead. Silence. The bride's smile dropped. "What?" The woman crossed her arms. "You told me, at the hotel, this wasn't happening. That you were gonna leave her." The groom turned bright red. He tried to deny it, but the woman pulled out her phone. She had the messages. The bride took one look at the screen, turned, and punched the groom in the face. The guests exploded into chaos. The wedding was over instantly. And the bride? She took the honeymoon trip by herself. Story 31. At my friend's wedding, everything was going smoothly, until the groom's other fiancé walked in. It was right after the ceremony, during cocktail hour. The guests were mingling, the bride was glowing, and the groom was joking with his groomsmen. That's when the doors slammed open and a woman stormed in, furious. She was dressed up, but not in a wedding guest kind of way. More like she had been expecting to get married too. She pointed at the groom and shouted loud enough for everyone to hear, "You were supposed to marry me next weekend, you lying piece of garbage." Silence. The bride slowly turned to her new husband. "What is she talking about?" she whispered. The groom's face turned gray. He muttered, "I can explain." But the woman wasn't done. She held up her phone and played a voicemail from him, recorded just days before. In it, he told her, "Just hold on, baby. This wedding is just for show. I'll fix everything after." The bride didn't even hesitate. She took off her wedding ring, threw it at him, and said, "Have fun explaining this to my lawyer." The guests exploded into whispers. The woman walked out in triumph. The groom, he was escorted out by security before he could make it worse. Divorce papers were filed within a week. Story 32. My cousin's wedding was a spectacle. Lavish, expensive, planned down to the second. But one small mistake exposed everything. The mistake? A slideshow mix-up. During the reception, they had a cute slideshow of the couple's journey. It was supposed to be sweet. Baby pictures, old dates, vacation memories. Except about halfway through, the screen suddenly showed a picture of the groom kissing another woman. At first, everyone thought it was an editing error. But then more pictures followed. Texts, screenshots, hotel reservations. The bride's maid of honor grabbed the mic, cleared her throat, and said, "Oops, wrong slideshow. But while we're here, I think the bride should see these." The groom lunged at the laptop to shut it off, but it was too late. The bride just sat there, shaking. Then she stood up, grabbed a glass of champagne, and said, "Well, guess I just saved myself a messy divorce." She drank the entire glass, put it down, and walked out. The groom? Left in disgrace. The maid of honor? Was a legend. Story 33. I was at a wedding where the bride's mother ruined everything in the most selfish way possible. The ceremony was beautiful, and the couple had just finished saying their vows. As soon as they were pronounced husband and wife, everyone cheered. That's when the bride's mom collapsed. People rushed to her, panicking. She was crying, gasping, acting like she was having a medical emergency. The wedding stopped. Someone called 911. The bride was sobbing, terrified. Then, the paramedics arrived. They checked her vitals, asked her a few questions, and then one of them turned to the bride and said, "She's fine. There's nothing wrong with her." Silence. The mother suddenly sat up, wiped her eyes, and said, "Well, I just didn't feel special today." The room collectively lost it. The groom grabbed the bride's hand and said, "We're leaving. We'll finish this at the reception." And they did, without the mother. Story 34. I was the best man at my buddy's wedding, and I had no idea that I'd be ruining his life, or saving it. I was halfway through my speech at the reception when the groom's phone, plugged into the DJ speakers for music, lit up. It was a text notification that everyone could see on the projector screen behind me. It said, "You were amazing last night. Can't believe you're married now, LOL." Silence. The bride slowly turned her head toward him. The groom? He looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Oh, shh." The bride grabbed his phone, scrolled through his messages, and then threw it across the room. The wedding was over. I thought I ruined my best friend's life. Turns out he did that himself. Story 35. At my cousin's wedding, the groom's father interrupted the ceremony in the most insane way possible. Everything was normal. The couple was standing at the altar, the officiant was speaking, and guests were smiling. Then, right before the "I do" moment, the groom's father stood up. He cleared his throat and said, "Before you continue, I just want to remind my son about our family tradition." People chuckled awkwardly. The groom shifted uncomfortably. The bride smiled politely and asked, "What tradition?" The father smiled and said, "Oh, all the men in our family cheat. It's just how we are." The room went dead silent. The bride's smile vanished. She turned to the groom, eyes wide. "Is this true?" she asked. He looked at the floor. Her voice shook when she asked again, "Is this true?" And then, like a coward, he whispered, "It's just a joke." But his father smirked. The bride? She dropped her bouquet, turned, and walked out. Wedding? Over. Marriage? Never happened. Groom? Completely humiliated. And the father? Still smirking like an idiot. Story 36. I'll never forget the wedding where the groom's brother destroyed everything in a matter of seconds. It was a sunny afternoon wedding in the countryside. The kind that looked like it came straight out of a Pinterest board. The ceremony was beautiful, and the bride was stunning. But as soon as the vows were exchanged, things took a weird turn. The groom's brother, let's call him Sam, had been acting strangely the entire day. He was quiet, distant, and barely smiled. But no one thought much of it at first. Then came the reception. The speeches were going well, and the best man was in the middle of his toast when Sam grabbed the microphone from him. At first, it seemed like a joke, but it wasn't. Sam stared at the bride and said, "I'm just here to make one thing clear. I'm the one who was supposed to marry him." The room went dead silent. He continued, "I was the one he truly loved, the one he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. But you came along and ruined." The bride's face turned ashen. The groom looked at Sam in horror and whispered, "What are you talking about?" Sam laughed bitterly. "I guess you didn't know, but we've been seeing each other for the past 6 months. Behind your back." The groom froze. The room was in complete shock. The bride, tears streaming down her face, ran out of the venue, leaving the groom standing there, humiliated. The marriage never happened. Sam? He didn't even stick around to apologize. The worst part? The groom eventually admitted that he had always been in love with his brother, but never had the courage to admit it until that night. Story 37. It was the kind of wedding that seemed like a fairy tale. Beautiful venue, perfect dress, the whole works. But what happened during the vows forever changed how I looked at the bride and groom. The ceremony was well underway, and the bride and groom were about to exchange their vows. It was a beautiful moment. The air was filled with love, and everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the couple to say their most heartfelt words. When it was the bride's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and began. "I promise to love you," she said, "through the good times, the bad, and everything in between." She paused, then added, "But there's something you should know. I'm not really in love with you." A sharp gasp echoed through the crowd. The groom's face went from a smile to confusion to horror in a split second. The bride continued, "I'm in love with your best friend, Jack. I've been sleeping with him for the last year. I thought I could go through with the wedding, but I can't lie to you anymore." Everyone was frozen. The groom looked like he'd been hit with a ton of bricks. He just stared at her in shock. Without a word, the bride took off her ring, threw it at him, and walked away. It was the most uncomfortable thing I have ever witnessed. The groom didn't chase after her. He didn't say anything. He simply turned to the crowd and muttered, "I guess this wedding's over." It turned out that he had been suspicious for a while. But when he saw the bride and Jack together at the reception, it was too late. The marriage was called off that night. Story 38. The wedding started like any other. A beautiful outdoor ceremony, vows exchanged, and everyone seemed happy. But it didn't take long for things to fall apart at my cousin's wedding. After the ceremony, the reception was well underway. The food was delicious and everyone was having a good time. That is, until the bride's ex showed up. It was about an hour into the reception when I saw a man walking toward the bride. At first I thought he was just a guest, but then I realized it was her ex. He walked right up to the bride, ignoring her husband entirely, and said, "I never stopped loving you. I'm still waiting for the groom." He didn't even flinch. He stood there, silent. The bride just stared at her ex, and I could see the confusion and guilt on her face. I thought maybe she'd say something, maybe ask him to leave. But no. Instead, she said, "I still love you too." That was all it took. The room was frozen in silence. The bride turned to her new husband and said, "I'm so sorry, but I need to go with him." She left the reception with her ex right there and then, abandoning her new husband in front of all the guests. To make matters worse, the groom didn't fight back. He just stood there, staring into the distance as his wife walked away. He eventually packed up, went home, and filed for divorce. No one ever heard from her again. Story 39. I went to a wedding where the bride's father created a spectacle that no one will ever forget. The ceremony was lovely, and the couple looked radiant as they exchanged their vows. But when it was time for the father-daughter dance, things took a sharp turn. The bride had always been close with her father, so the dance was something that everyone was looking forward to. But halfway through, he suddenly stopped dancing. He looked at his daughter and said, "I have to tell you something. This isn't just a father-daughter dance. I'm here to warn you." The crowd was confused. What could he possibly be talking about? Then he looked at the groom and added, "You're making the biggest mistake of your life. You have no idea who she really is?" The bride's face turned bright red, and she pulled away from him, whispering, "Dad, please stop." But he kept going. "You think she's the perfect angel," he continued, "but she's been cheating on you for months. I know because she told me herself." The groom looked at her, stunned. His eyes locked with the bride, and you could see the guilt in her eyes. The worst part? The bride didn't deny it. She just stood there, motionless, as her father dragged her secret into the light. The groom stormed off, the bride ran after him, and the reception was ruined. She tried to apologize later, but it was too late. He had already filed for annulment. Story 40. At my friend's wedding, there was a moment of pure betrayal that took everyone by surprise. The ceremony had just wrapped up, and everyone was transitioning to the reception. That's when the groom's ex-girlfriend showed up. She wasn't invited. No one knew she was coming. But there she was, standing at the entrance with a huge grin on her face. She walked straight up to the bride and said, "You should be thanking me for making sure he's finally tied down." Confused, the bride asked, "What are you talking about?" The ex said, "You're welcome, sweetie. I made sure he would never leave you." Then, she turned to the groom and said, "I'm pregnant with your baby. We're going to be a family just like we always planned." The bride stood there, shaking. The groom's face went from confusion to rage as he ran over to the ex. He said, "You lied to me. You told me the baby was mine. But you didn't tell her about the abortion you had last week, did you?" The ex suddenly went pale, and it was clear she was caught in a lie. The bride, tears in her eyes, turned to the groom and whispered, "I can't do this." She walked away, leaving him standing there. The wedding was over before it had even begun. Story 41. I was at a wedding where everything seemed perfect until the groom's phone rang during the ceremony. It was a beautiful outdoor wedding. the kind where you'd expect everything to go smoothly. The bride looked radiant as she walked down the aisle, and the groom was so excited, his smile could light up the entire venue. But then, during the vows, his phone buzzed. At first, no one paid it any attention, assuming it was just an innocent notification. But when it rang again, louder this time, the groom reached into his pocket to silence it. That's when everything changed. He looked at the phone, then at the bride, his face going pale. He stumbled a bit, then said, I need to take this. The entire audience sat in stunned silence as the groom stepped away from the altar. The bride looked confused, but then he stepped outside. Seconds turned into minutes. And just when we were starting to wonder if something was wrong, the groom's voice came over the loudspeaker. I'm so sorry, but I can't go through with this. We all turned to look at the bride, who was now standing frozen. The groom walked back into the ceremony, phone in hand, looking visibly shaken. He handed the phone to the bride. She took it, and a text message popped up from a woman named Amy. I'm 10 weeks pregnant. I thought you should know before it's too late. The bride's face went white. The groom looked horrified. The entire room waited for the bride's response, but she didn't speak. She simply turned around, walked down the aisle, and left. The wedding was officially canceled. The groom tried to run after her, but she was gone. Weeks later, I heard they broke up, obviously. But the whole experience made me question how easily secrets can change everything. Story 42. I went to a wedding that had one of the most awkward moments I've ever witnessed. The couple seemed perfect, but the bride's father turned everything upside down. The ceremony was beautiful. Everything went according to plan. The couple exchanged vows, tears were shed, and the guests were all smiles. But when the reception started, things started to unravel. During the father-daughter dance, the bride's father was acting a little odd. He was staring at his daughter with this intense gaze, like he was trying to say something, but couldn't find the words. After a few moments of dancing, he pulled her aside and whispered something in her ear. The bride smiled politely, but I could tell she was getting uncomfortable. Suddenly, he pulled her into a tight hug and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "You're still my little girl, and I'll always love you. But I think you know that this wedding is a mistake." The whole room fell silent. The bride pulled back in shock, her face turning bright red. She shook her head and said, "Dad, what are you talking about?" The groom, who had been watching from across the room, walked over and asked what was going on. The father then turned to him and said, "You don't deserve her. She's better than this. She can do so much better than you." The bride was mortified. She tried to calm her father down, but his words were like a bomb going. The groom tried to argue, but it was too late. The bride finally said, "I don't know what's happening anymore." She ran off, leaving the reception hall behind. The wedding was called off right there, and the father became an outcast in the family for what he did. Story 43. I was at a wedding where the bride's sister made everything about her. It started innocently enough. Everyone was laughing, chatting, and enjoying the reception. But then, the sister of the bride took the mic and gave her toast. It was supposed to be a sweet moment. She started by praising her sister, how beautiful she looked, and how happy she was that the couple had found each other. But then, her tone shifted. "I have a confession to make," she said. "I almost married. He was mine first, but I gave him up for her." The room went quiet. Everyone turned to look at the groom, who was staring at the floor, suddenly looking uncomfortable. The bride? She looked shocked, her face full of disbelief. Her sister continued, "You see, I had feelings for him long before she ever knew him. But I was too scared to act on it, so I let her take him. I didn't think they'd last, but here we are." The groom tried to laugh it off, but the awkwardness was palpable. The bride, however, was furious. "You're kidding, right?" she said to her sister. "You're doing this now? At my wedding." The sister simply smiled and took a sip of her drink. The bride immediately walked off, leaving her sister and the groom standing in the middle of the reception hall. The whole event came to a halt and no one knew what to do. The wedding was quietly dissolved, and the couple ended up separating soon after. The bride's sister? She didn't even apologize.